Senator Ensign, I thank you for your courtesy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the remarks that Senator Wyden just talked about. There's no question that some of the economic effects of our tax code are just complying with the tax code. It's a huge burden on individuals as well as businesses in complying with our tax code. I mean, you just look at the estate tax, death tax, whatever you want to talk about, the complexities of trying to avoid, taxes, the huge cost. Businesses make investments sometimes based on the tax code instead of what's necessarily makes good economic sense. And so there's no question, I believe very strongly that the best thing that we could do is what you just talked about, Mr. Elmendorf, and that is broadening the base and lowering the tax rates. I think that it is absolutely the best way to go. I do want to pick up on something that you said a little while ago. You said that if we lower tax rates in one of your charts over the next couple of years, it will increase GDP. Is the opposite true if we raise taxes over the next in other words, if we let the tax rates that are on the books currently expire, will GDP go down?
Well, so our economic baseline, as you know, has to be conditioned on current law. So our economic forecast assumes that those tax cuts expire. And relative to that, an extension, so it's relative to that we've done our estimates. Relative to that, an extension of the tax cuts would in fact boost GDP and would boost employment. Conversely, if one's pictured starting from that point, then having the tax cuts expire would lower GDP. I just want to be clear that effect is essentially in our economic forecast.
Right, but it does make sense that so raising taxes will decrease the GDP. In other words, if those go up, there's no question the GDP will go down versus keeping those tax rates where they are today.
Yes, over the next few years, right? That's the short-term effects.
Yes, I think that's important. And I also, I think some of the analysis that you have done as far as the long term is very, very important. And like you said, it's not just the tax cuts, the spending, both of those things. I agree with you. I think if we're going to do these tax cuts, we should actually be looking at ways to cut spending, because it isn't just the short-term economy that we need to think about here. We need to be responsible in the long term. And while ideally doing what Senator Wyden is talking about, to me, that would be the best way to do it. And if we could lower the rates low enough and do that, paying for it through lowering spending, in the long run, we're going to be better off as an economy, as a country. And obviously, those are tough choices to make along the way. But the responsible thing to me, because the biggest threat to long-term economic output is the debt, is it not?
Yes, I think that's right, Senator. I think the challenge on the spending side is that the revenue loss from extending the tax cuts is a very large number. As we've reported, based on estimates from the staff, the Joint Committee on Taxation, the full extension would reduce revenue by nearly $4 trillion over the next 10 years.
What percentage of revenues is that over 10 years?
That I don't know offhand. I think we do report in our, so I guess we report in this testimony that a full extension would reduce tax revenue by about 2% of GNP in 2020 against a base that's around 20% or so of GNP.
I'm talking about as far as...
About a 10% reduction in revenues. About a 10% reduction in revenues.
10% reduction in revenues over that period of time. Have you all looked at what states and cities are doing as far as cutting their budgets?
We follow it a little bit, not as closely as we follow.
Do we think there's 10% waste in the federal government?
Well, I think the problem turns out to be that one person's view of what's the waste differs from the other person's view of what's the waste.
Okay, let's take it this way. Every family, every business, local governments, state governments across America right now are cutting their budgets, and they're basically wringing out the waste. Okay? You talk to every business in America, and that's what they've done over the last 2 years. And this is the private sector, and they had a lot of fat. The private sector did. Local governments had a lot of fat. State governments had a lot of fat, and they're wringing that out. The one place where we haven't wrung out and cut the fat is at the federal level. If we can sit here and honestly say that we don't think there's at least 10% waste in the federal government, that is completely it's a preposterous statement to think that we don't have at least 10% waste in this government, inefficiency in this government. And so all I'm saying is that $4 trillion a big number? Sounds like a big number, except when you look at it as 10%. And if we don't think that we can take 10% and get this government more efficient by 10%, by cutting out inefficient programs and streamlining programs, eliminating duplication, eliminating waste, I think that if this Congress can't find 10% waste, this Congress, shouldn't be, they should throw us all out. That's all I'm saying. And that's why I think that the 10% number is really, really important.
So, Senator, it's up to you and your colleagues, not our place, to say what parts of the government should be bigger or smaller in what ways. But I do want to just emphasize the magnitude of the problem here. So the left set of bars show revenues and then spending under current law, and the right set show them with the tax cuts extended in the AMT indexed, the full extension through 2020 we've been talking about. So that on the right-hand set of bars, that red box is the size of the deficit. You can see that amount is larger than all of the spending on Social Security in 2020. It's, I think, a little smaller than all of the federal spending on Medicare and Medicaid and health insurance subsidies. It's much larger than all spending on defense. It's much larger, you can see, than the box right next to it, which is all spending apart from those handful of the largest programs.
And a big part of that, a big part of the reason for those deficits is because in that year, that $1.4 trillion deficit, at that point, how much of that is interest on the debt?
Well, so interest is large, and you can...
It's over $900 billion, isn't that correct?
Exactly. With those tax cuts extended, that's our estimate.
That's because we're adding to it every year right now at such huge numbers. And what Senator Gregg talked about spending being the largest part of the problem, that's why at the federal level we need to get spending under control. That's why we are at a critical point, because this is unsustainable. The numbers you're putting up here, it's unsustainable. This country is going to become Greece, except we don't have the European Union to bail us out. If we have these kind of debt and deficit numbers going into the future, it is unsustainable. And that's why this Congress needs to heed the warning that we have to get our spending habits under control. It is critical for the future of this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Warner.